Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first in a new series of Construction Question Time with Brandon Silver. Brandon is a trainee solicitor with Silver Ash, currently sitting in the construction team, having worked on the property team as well, and has a lot of experience in both areas. He will be answering a different question every week, questions that we get frequently asked, particularly at seminars and events. And today's question is going to be about liquidated damages. So hello, Brandon, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you, Judy. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Right, the question. Can a client deduct liquidated damages if they have not incurred a loss?
So yeah, that's a good question. So before I address the answer to that question, I think it's first important to define what liquidated damages are. So liquidated damages are predetermined damages that would be agreed between the parties to the contract and would be payable upon breach by one of the parties. By way of comparison, the other type of damages are general damages, and they're typically considered as being at large. And what that means is that the party that is trying to seek the damages has to prove the loss. And of course, that's going to be a lot more difficult. To kind of give a couple of examples of liquidated damages being in contracts, they can be a fixed sum of, say, for example, £2,500 payable per week on delay of the works, or alternatively, it could be 1% of the contract sum per week of delay. So now addressing the question at hand, the simple answer is yes, you can claim liquidated damages despite not incurring any loss. It does not matter if the loss suffered is actually greater or larger than the sum of the liquidated damages, and you do not have to prove the actual loss. However, the longer answer is this depends on one, the actual liquidated damages clause, and number two, the circumstances of which it's being claimed. So let's just address those 2 points in hand. Firstly, the first case that kind of deals with liquidated damages is Dunlop pneumatic tyres versus New Garage and Motor. Now, what this case says is that for a liquidated damages clause to be enforceable and to basically work and not be held as a penalty clause, it must be a genuine pre-estimate of the loss. So what this means, for example, is that the clause must intend not to penalise the contractor, but rather to compensate the employer. So that's kind of the starting point. Is it a genuine pre-estimate of the loss? If it is held that it's not a genuine pre-estimate of the loss, for example, the sum that they seek is extravagant in comparison to the greatest loss that could be incurred as a result of that, that doesn't mean that it will be a penalty clause and therefore not enforceable, but may be. And this goes on to the second case that I will talk about, which is Parking Eye versus Beavis. Now, what this case held is that if there was this liquidated damage clause and it was held that it was not a genuine pre-estimate of the loss, then you need to look to see if there's a legitimate interest. If there is a legitimate interest, is that legitimate interest justified to require the defaulting party, the party in breach, to pay the sum in excess of the loss that's actually suffered? So in this case, Parking Eye versus Beavis, a client obviously was parking in a parking bay and went over the time allotted and had to pay a penalty charge of £85. Now, this was held as being a not genuine pre-estimate of the loss because the loss suffered was less than the £85. However, they held that it was not penal because there was a legitimate interest which justified that. And this goes on to the second point, that it must be legitimate interest and that the charge, so in this case £85, must not be out of all proportion to the legitimate interest. Now, in this case, the legitimate interest was for a couple of reasons. Number one, obviously, they wanted to make a profit, the company. Secondly, that they wanted to prevent and deter clients from parking in parking bays for longer than they paid for. And finally, just to manage the efficient use of the car park. So for all those reasons, it was actually held that the liquidated damages, the £85, could be deducted. So taking this all into consideration, the first step, is it a genuine pre-estimate of the loss? If it is, then you're fine. If it's not, then you need to address the circumstances, looking at the legitimate interest and whether or not it's out of all proportion. Finally, just looking back going back to the genuine pre-estimate of the loss and the case of Dunlop, there is in that case a presumption, which then this is quite interesting, especially looking at it from the construction industry, that when you have, for example, the occurrence of several different events and the stipulated sum, i.e. the liquidated damages, is the same for the occurrence of all of those events, some of those events may be causing serious damage and some of them may cause trivial damage. Now, the impact of this is that that would be deemed as not a genuine pre-estimate of the loss, because some of those events, the delay of them, is not going to incur as much damage to the innocent party as to others. And therefore, because it's a stipulated sum for all, it's going to be not genuine, not pre-estimate. So to resolve this, if you've got different milestones, you should ensure that there's a liquidated damage sum for each of those sectional milestones, and if there's a delay, to reflect what the loss would have been had the delay occurred. So I hope that answers all of hope that answers the question. And next week I'm going to be discussing abatement and set off. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that. That was a great explanation, Brandon, and we look forward to hearing more from you next week. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Take care.